Hi, welcome everybody. It's just great to feel the energy in the room. Energy. You see what I did there? So I'm joined today by Katie Huff, the Blue Waters Associate Professor and Director of the Advanced Reactor Fuel Cycles Laboratory, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which also, by the way, has a great physics department. Yeah. Yes. Are there any Urbana UIUC alums in the room? Is that what I just heard the clapping from? Yeah? Yeah, all right, okay. Also one of the best engineering programs in the country, I think. Sunita Satyapal, the Director of the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office at the US Department of Energy, also a C3E ambassador. And Jen Schaefer, the Associate Director for Technology at ARPA-E. So I think we'll start with asking each of you to say something about your role, what you're doing, and also, since this is a conference that a lot of earlier career women come to, how did you get there? Yeah.
All right, I can start. So I'm a professor of nuclear engineering. I have been a professor at the University of Illinois for almost 9 years, and I took a 3-year break for the last 3 years to be on unpaid leave of absence to serve the Biden-Harris administration as the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy, which meant I oversaw the operations of the Office of Nuclear Energy. It was a great privilege and an honor, and I'm really excited to be here amongst you all. And the question of how I got here is largely that I got a physics degree and a nuclear engineering PhD, and I went and did a postdoc at Berkeley, and then I became a professor, and happily was an assistant professor 5 years in, submitting my tenure packet, and I got a phone call from Christopher Davis at DOE, and everything changed. And I was able to sort of take on this really exciting job. I'm really proud of what we did for those few years with these fine ladies. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But sometimes there's a great deal of serendipity in an otherwise very normal, boring academic pathway.
I'm Jennifer Schaefer, Associate Director for Technology at ARPA-E. And for those of you who are not familiar with ARPA-E, right, we're modeled off of DARPA, and if you're not familiar with DARPA, basically what this means is that we are a high-risk, high-reward agency where program directors come in with their ideas of what they would like to do, launch a focused research program. And so, for example, for me, I'm very passionate about nuclear. Snuck that in there with both Katie and I being on the panel, but I came to the agency to launch a program in nuclear fuel recycling. And so other program directors come in with their ideas, whether it's looking at power electronics, batteries and storage, super hot geothermal, pick your idea. And we collaborate with our Department of Energy partners to make sure that we're not redundant, we're complementary, and we're taking on things that maybe they're not in the position to do. And so and my associate program or director of technology role, what I do is I work with the program directors in crafting their programs. So these are about anywhere from $30 to $40 million efforts that launch anywhere from 3 to 4 years in a very focused area, like I said. And so in that experience, I've had the really great opportunity to learn so much about the energy space, enough to know that I will never know all of it. But this is basically what I've been doing on a day-to-day. And before I was there, I was a professor of chemistry and in the nuclear science and engineering program at Colorado School of Mines. So.
Great. So it's great to be here, and a big congratulations to all the awardees. And I started, and some of you who were here in the morning heard our Undersecretary, Jerry Richmond. I actually did my undergrad at Bryn Mawr College when she was a professor there, and so she had a lot of influence. And then my PhD at Columbia University, physical chemistry, laser diagnostics, went, very geeky academic route. Also thought I wanted to be a professor. My mother, actually, a big shout out, who's retired now, but was a physics professor, nuclear theoretical physics. She got her PhD in the 60s, before she got married, which was, a big deal then for women. And I love teaching. I taught for a couple of years, but I didn't have the patience for grading. It was at Vassar College. We didn't have TAs. And so I thought I would try something else and went to industry. So I was at United Technologies, which is an amazing company, did lots of research, was fortunate enough to, get patents, and got sucked into management really early. So I had a number of labs, But then I was also an idealist, and like many of you here, it's so inspiring to hear all the stories. And so I took, and kind of a little crazy maybe, and took a big pay cut, had to sell all my stock options, and came to government, and that was over 21 years ago. So I've been at the Department of Energy, and a big shout out to my office, and here's my hydrogen pin here, which, by the way, it was $6 on Amazon. I wear it everywhere. So again, I think like many here in the room, hydrogen has been an underdog for a long time. So now finally it's getting a lot of attention, but I think that's been my passion and mission, to try to see how do we get hydrogen and fuel cells across the finish line. So it's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. And also, I really want to thank you for being in government. It's really wonderful. The people who spend time there either for a few years or career employees who spend a couple decades there and just keep everything working, while the country does whatever it's going to do politically. In the US, we have just so many wonderful government employees. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to talk today about accelerating clean energy technology pathways. And so in order to do that, we'll talk about 3 different stages of the pathways. Technology that's here today, maybe developed recently very quickly, technology that's near at hand, and how is it progressing? What are the most significant barriers, and how can we overcome them? And also, what are the really difficult sectors, and what might be the game-changing technologies that are still far out, but that you can see on the horizon and hope will be there for those really difficult things. Let's start with technologies that are here today. What are you excited about that's ready now, and what was surprising about how quickly it developed? Jen, let's start with you.
Yeah. So technologies are here today. So I'll admit that my perspective on this is a little bit ARPA-E biased as far as things that we've been investing in, but this is just because where I'm most familiar with the space, right? And so there are 3 technologies that I'm going to speak to. The first one is a company called Natron that just opened one of their production facilities, $1 billion+ production facility in Holland, Michigan this April. And so that's a sodium battery company that's basically looking for grid scale battery storage. And what's interesting about the sodium battery technology is that it's a complement to lithium-ion battery. One of the challenges that you do have with lithium-ion battery is some of the critical mineral supply chain aspects associated with it, not just the lithium, but also the copper, the cobalt, all of these things that string together. And what you get with sodium, at least in this particular branding of what Natron's technology allows, is you have sodium, you have iron, you have manganese. These are all things that are very abundant domestically. And also the technology itself is much more rapid charging. It provides good compatibility with grid needs. And frankly, with the emergence of data center and data center needs, we're finding actually that there's great complementarity with respect to what they're up to. Another technology that I'll focus on is Ampere, which has basically got its headquarters in Long Beach, California. And so Ampere is a hybrid electric aviation technology. And what's interesting about when you go hybrid electric aviation is you actually cut your emissions by 50 to 70%. And while you're actually doing that, you end up cutting your operating costs as an airline by approximately 30%. So I know that what's been on our minds a lot today is how do we actually facilitate the clean energy transition while we're actually bringing about an economic transition. And this is a great example where there are synergies within that. And so that's something that's on the horizon. And they've already logged 25,000 hours worth of flight time with some of their hybrid electric aircraft. And then the last one I'll speak to is Niron. They actually just had their ribbon cutting ceremony back in this October. And so Niron is actually a magnet company that doesn't use rare earth materials, but has the world's strongest non-rare earth based magnet. And so, so they're getting ready to start their production in actually Minnesota as well. And so we're seeing these technologies come forward. And you asked about, what surprises you about how quickly they came up. These are all technologies that took about a decade to come. So they didn't come up quickly, but I think something, and maybe Katie will hit on this as well, is the role that AI perhaps is going to have with respect to what it means for our energy transition. And I think that's going to be a major disrupting force in a lot of ways. So that's where I'm at there.
That is so cool. Honestly, to me, a decade is really quickly.
All right, well, there we go.
It's not quick enough.
It's not quick enough.
I know we need to be quicker, but if you had told me a decade ago, I'll be sitting next to an ARPA-E person who will tell me about 50 to 70% reductions in the aviation industry, I would have been like, wow, that is amazing.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Sunita, how about you?
Maybe the one I'll highlight, and I won't name any companies because there's so many, but again, in the hydrogen space, I would say just from our funding alone, since 2004, we enabled over 1,089 patents. These are US issued patents, so tracking the benefit of taxpayer dollars. We have about 30 commercial technologies as a result of our funding, and then another 65 that we think could be commercial the next few years. So this ranges from like catalysts, membranes, all the way to full systems. So electrolyzers alone, our funding has helped to reduce the cost, I think 90% in the last over 2 decades. So great examples of progress. I'd love to connect some of the investors here. Again, some of them unfortunately are close to that valley of death. So again, maybe the one I'll highlight that really is here, again, many people talk about hydrogen being always 5 years ahead, but this is one that we invested in with the American Recovery Act around 2009 timeframe. And so it was a very niche application for hydrogen and fuel cells, and it was forklifts. So inside warehouses where there's a need for zero emissions, it was harder to use batteries because of the charging time and the extra space and so forth. So it was, again, a very specific application where hydrogen and fuel cell forklifts made sense. And so we funded some of the very early demos. It was actually really hard. We had ups and downs. We worked with our federal partners, DOD, and funded a few hundred, and now there are about 70,000 out there, and major companies like Amazon, Walmart, actually using hydrogen fuel cell forklifts, so it's really enabled that infrastructure. And what most people don't know is every few seconds, some customers refueling with hydrogen. So that's an example of something that's actually here now as a result.
So cool.
That's a good fun fact.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, standard conventional fission nuclear power is very much here today, and there have been some interesting advancements in the last couple of years.
I saw some people going like this when you said that.
Yeah. We're here today, right? There's 94 reactors in 54 locations at 54 plants across 28 states. It is 48% of our carbon-free electricity in the United States. It's about 18% of our total electricity in the United States in terms of generation. And there was a real risk that we were going to continue to go down in the number of reactors that are currently operating in the United States. When I first started as assistant secretary, there were 92. By the time, or there were 93. By the time I ended, there were 94. 1 shut down and 2 came up. And one of the ones that shut down, Palisades in Michigan, is being restarted. And 3 Mile Island is not the one that had the accident, but the other unit that's been operating safely next to it this whole time is also restarting. And that, I think, is the really exciting, surprising thing. You sort of asked what's kind of surprising about what's here today. For me, all credit to everyone at DOE and across the industry and everywhere else in the labor unions that made this happen. The notion of restarting a nuclear power plant that has entered decommissioning is completely new. It is brand new. I wrote a whole article actually recently in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists about what it's going to take, and it's totally doable, but we have avoided it entirely. And now the economics are right. The Inflation Reduction Act made a lot of the economic situation proper for incentives for these reactors that were economically infeasible, fighting with cheap natural gas, to now restart, get back on the grid. And that's like 1.6 gigawatts of new power that will be on the grid in the next couple of years. We also had Vogtle, 2 units turning on, over schedule, over budget, but they're on. And that's 2.2 other gigawatts, right? And so I was really lucky, though it had very little to do with me, to be the first assistant secretary in quite a long time to see more nuclear power plants on at the end of my term than when I started. And so that was a little bit of the surprising thing. I think, just in terms of big tech, which Jen mentioned, I will say some of this is because of the incredible mountain of decarbonization that we're going to have to climb in order to satisfy the demands of big tech. Big tech really wants lots of power, and they've made a lot of clean energy commitments, more power to them, but by creating a demand that is so large, they are creating a significantly higher mountain for us to climb with our net zero goals. But the thing that they're doing to support it is investing in some of these clean energy technologies. So we're seeing some of that from Google and Amazon and Meta and Microsoft. And in the case of Microsoft, of course, they've partnered with Constellation to restart Three Mile Island. So in a very real sense, one of these great surprising victories is in part because of Microsoft's interest in clean power.
Awesome. Katie, I want to move on to stuff that's a little farther away, but you just made a strong case that the technology for conventional nuclear power is here today.
Totally.
And it's great that you had some increase in power plants, but it wasn't a game-changing increase, was it? I mean, so what is the biggest barrier? What would it take to say, hey, 4 years from now, how could we have nuclear power really being a very significant part of a reliable 24/7 decarbonized portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, we've worked backwards in DOE from our net zero goals and figured out, how many new nuclear plants are going to have to be built by 2050, and it's about 200 new gigawatts of nuclear power need to be added to the 96-ish gigawatts that we currently have, which is, if you could
so tripling.
Supply. We're tripling nuclear power. We said that at COP28 too, along with like 20-something other countries. And so in order to get there, in the next 3-4 years, we need to see so many orders on the books for new nuclear reactors that we are guaranteed to get past the first-of-a-kind expenses of initial builds of some of these newer technologies. And so we are seeing some of that. Like we saw significant investment from Google in a power purchase agreement with Kairos, a nuclear reactor company. And when they build, Google will be the off-taker. The same happened with Amazon, though they put real dollars on the line, $500 million investment in X Energy, right? And their intent is to be an off-taker. And those customer orders provide some financial stability to allow some of these new technologies to deploy, but they must deploy. And we have to be well on our way to dozens and dozens of builds and licenses 4 years from now in order to get to 200 new reactors. Yeah.
Okay, so we have our work cut out for us. What about technology that's near at hand, not really here today, but pretty close? Where do you see a lot of progress happening, and what do you see as the most significant barriers and pathways? And then, yeah.
So I'll hop in here, and I'm also trying to be a little bit mindful of making sure that we're getting a potpourri of some, right, I've talked a little bit about magnets, which are so critical with respect to energy infrastructure. We're talking about aviation when I mentioned Ampere, and we talked about a little bit with storage with Natron there, and some other things that if only just for a moment that I might talk for a little bit about nuclear. I think microreactors are just something that, and it's really interesting because this is actually ARPA-E held a microreactor workshop when we first started to get into the area of nuclear and figuring out what we could do in this space. And in a couple of years from now, hopefully at INL, we'll have 3 microreactors deployed. There'll be other instances of microreactor deployment in Tennessee. And so this is a technology, apropos of the things that Katie was talking about. People have been asking, like, what are the things that I can be tracking to understand if nuclear is on track? And it's all of these things that play a role in building that curve and helping us with our understanding. So that's one. The other one that I'd speak to a little bit is Queen's Carbon. So this is a company that industrial decarbonization is hard. We have 3 transitions trying to go on simultaneously, at least right now. We've got the energy transition, we've got the carbon transition, and we've got the steel and materials transition, including cement and that. All of these things are actually happening in concert. And what Queen's Carbon is thinking about is taking, basically, it's some form of almost a scrap recycle technology, though they wouldn't call it that. It's taking legacy cement material and mixing it with the core feedstocks that you need, limestone, clay, sand, et cetera, and doing this in an electrochemical process instead of the classical, basically, limestone cracking that you need to do at 1600 degrees C, which releases a significant amount of CO2. And by doing this at 500 degrees C, you can enable viable electrochemical processes, and you can enable an approach to support decarbonization of something like the cement industry. The other place that I'll think about is when it comes to our windows. We release 4 quads of energy a year through our windows. And we've thought a lot about ways that we can potentially decrease that substantially. And aerogels have been around for a while as far as being able to provide some of that insulation. The problem is they always have this blue tinge associated with them. And there's just a practical cosmetics aspect associated with windows. And so with that, AeroShield is another company that we've been investing in and working with. They actually have a transparency in their aerogel material that's more transparent than glass. And so now you're actually getting through that cosmetic barrier. And it's not going to probably facilitate retrofits, but when it comes to new builds, it's all these sorts of things with efficiency plays that could be critically enabling. So these are things that are coming down the pike shortly.
Super cool, yeah. Sunita, how about you?
Yeah, it's good that you have a broad portfolio, because the answer to every question I get is hydrogen. And in fact, I told the story a couple of times. I was giving a talk recently, and this is a true story, but because I'm such a hydrogen geek for so many years, and so I was in an Uber, and I'm always talking about, have you heard about the hydrogen cars and everything? And this happened twice, believe it or not, once in a taxi and once in a Lyft. And so at the end of it, the driver said, I think I had you as a customer before. It was actually true. It was 5 years ago. So I'm sorry. So my answer is hydrogen again. But I think, there are a lot of challenges. So we still have to get the cost down. We have, the deployments. We have, and it's not, and again, it complements, it's an enabler in many ways, carbon-free molecule. But unlike, if you take a specific technology like batteries, conversion, you have manufacturing, you have supply chain, you have a lot of those issues. But with hydrogen, you have production, you have delivery, storage, fuel cells, all the different end uses. And it's often called the Swiss Army knife of clean energy. You can produce it from diverse domestic sources. If it's nuclear, high temperature thermal integration, low temperature electrolysis, biomass has issues. Steam methane reforming with CCS. There's so many issues on the production side, delivery, storage, and end use, if it's industrial, heavy-duty trucks. So there's just a lot of challenges, but I think the main thing, actually, maybe I should ask, how many have seen the National Hydrogen Strategy, the National Clean Hydrogen Strategy?
Oh, look at this.
Oh, not that many. Okay, well, a few, but it's not the DOE strategy, it's really your strategy. So again, it was required in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and our secretary released it more than a year ago for public comments. It was the public comment period, and then we released the final. It has to be updated at least every 3 years. And so again, it's all of our strategy, and so this is the first time we have a national strategy for hydrogen. Over 50, I think 60 countries have them. And so if there's one thing, I know it's kind of the end of the day, everyone's tired, but there's one thing you want to take away to remember. And so when you go home and have dinner with your family, remember 50 by 50, that's the national goal. Today we produce roughly 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen. That's about 10% of the global capacity for refining, fertilizer mostly. The only other country that produces more is China. And then our goals include 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen, because most of that hydrogen today is not clean. It's just mostly natural gas without CCS. And then 20 million, double that by 2040, and then 5 times that, 50 by 50 by 2050. And that's not just production. We've really looked at all the potential end uses, industrial decarbonization, a segment of like heavy-duty transportation, long-duration energy storage, steel, ammonia production, sustainable aviation fuel, so all the different end uses. So it's both production and demand. And if we could get to that 50 by 50, that would enable up to 10% of total emissions reduction. So again, if we're trying to get to net zero by 2050, 10% is really huge. And so those hard to decarbonize sectors is where we're focusing on hydrogen.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think the near at hand thing, it's sort of when you go from generation 3 existing reactors to generation 3+ reactors that are being built now, like the AP1000, or very small modular light water reactors, you then progress into generation 4 reactors, which for nuclear engineers means creative coolants and fuels. For me, I have kind of 3 favorites, 2 coolants and 1 fuel. So in terms of coolants, you want right now, most of them are all light water, right? Unenriched water. High temperature gas reactors like the X-energy reactor or ultra-safe MMR or a handful of others, these can reach really high temperatures and they're cooled by helium. It's a pretty excellent coolant neutronically, and it can reach temperatures like 800 degrees Celsius, which starts to feed into what Sunita was talking about in terms of combined heat and power applications, or boosting things like electrolysis, if you can get to high temperature electrolysis, or even thermochemical cycles. Producing a single kilogram of hydrogen might have a higher energy return on investment if you start with thermal energy rather than starting at electrons. The same is also true of liquid metal coolants, which I think are pretty cool. TerraPower has a sodium coolant. Sodium is not salt, sodium is a metal until you combine it with something else. These are very cool neutronically and have the feature that as the, accident, if the temperature is going up, your coolant tends to drive your reactor towards more heat exchange, et cetera. The same is true in the helium case. And then the fuel. There's a very clever fuel. How many of you have heard of TRISO fuel? Well, okay, there's some hands. Look at that. Okay, so TRISO, this is the hot word, right? And you can even go to Mother Jones magazine to see how cool people think TRISO particles will save the world. TRISO particles are tristructural isotropic particles that are about the size of a chia seed, and they put the uranium fuel inside that tiny little canister that's made of silicon carbide layers surrounding the uranium. That silicon carbide is extremely robust, and so if you take those little teeny tiny particles and you embed them in, say, some graphite compact or pebble, now you have an extremely robust nuclear fuel that contains the uranium and then the fission products, this sort of waste once they've split, in incredible temperatures, well past the temperature of lava, right? We're talking about the heat flux that goes through the sun, not the temperature of the sun, but the heat flux. This is an incredible benefit because it means that the reactor will survive really any hypothetical accident. Any accident at all, you will not have a release of the fission products, which is the main danger of nuclear power plants. And we've got reactors that are commercializing today that do this. The X-energy reactor and others, some of these high-temperature gas reactors leverage this technology. So too does Kairos, which is a salt-cooled version of this kind of clever fuel. And so you may notice I mentioned 2 companies earlier, Kairos and X-energy. These are actually 2 companies that are being funded by Google and Amazon, respectively. And so, it's really interesting to see these companies kind of put a lot of dollars behind a technology that's really a next step. So those are my hopes.
No,
my dreams.
I love the idea of super safe nuclear reactors. Yeah. I'm thinking maybe I'll go out of order. The next thing that I want to talk about is about those things that are really difficult sectors to decarbonize and what the radical game changing is that's on the horizon, but I think we already touched on some of that. So let me come back around to that again, and let's take a break from this series of questions and see what questions and comments people have about what y'all have already said.
I think that the brilliant minds on the stage and in this room need to think very, very carefully and systematically about how we measure emissions. These are data. One 5-megawatt wind turbine is anchored with 30,000 tons of cement. Okay, and we need all of them now, and so we're going to be using a lot of cement. It's highly emitting. And I did a reference frame, not reality, but based on reality. You all know what reference frames are. Using Princeton Net Zero and EIA numbers, we need by 2030, 360,000 transmission towers. And those are made from aluminum, steel, and copper. So just wondering, are any of you all thinking about standardized methodologies for calculating emissions? because we don't have them. The price of carbon is different all over the country and all over the world, which suggests to me that it's nothing standardized. And I think that it's hugely important that those of you who are experts in these things need to be thinking about that. And then one final comment. I think that the microreactors are hugely important. And I mentioned data centers in my comments that by, we're going to 12% of our power generation in 2030 is going to be for data centers. If we could do on-site power generation with those small microreactors, okay, it would be hugely beneficial. And they're not emitting, and you could make green hydrogen in any surplus that you had. We don't have a regulatory structure that would support that. So just a few comments and thoughts. I'm wondering about measuring emissions.
Thank you for those comments and thoughts. So measuring emissions, very hard to decarbonize sectors, especially building infrastructure.
I can at least start to take a swing at that one. And so, yeah, so it's a great point, especially, I'll say while I came to RPE to work on things nuclear, actually one of the things that I did while I was there as well was launch a low emission iron and steel program. And one of the things when I was doing that is we recognized that the blast furnace is basically about 2/3 of the emission stack in your iron and steel production. But you have other emissions throughout the value chain, right, that you're documenting and keeping track of. And so while I've had some excellent conversations today actually about how we can perhaps harmonize those conversations and get past that, it's something that this is going to be, we really need our policy friends, I think, to help us with this. On the technological frame, I can go ahead and document and try and get a sense of what we need, where, and how my technologies can address the right part of the value chain or realize that they might benefit from, we talk about it in terms of process intensification, the idea that you can maybe take multiple unit operations across, say, for example, iron and steel, and try and perhaps even compress them into one unit operation so you aren't dealing with the emissions throughout that. So, I mean, this is something that it's certainly on our minds, at least at RPE. We try and do a lot of LCA analysis, but we'll definitely need broader policy support and community engages to help get us there. And I will say with respect to emissions, when it comes to renewables or even frankly nuclear, right, there's a lot of concrete that goes into a nuclear facility. These are things that while we want to be emitting as minimal as possible, even still with these technologies, right, we recognize that their life cycle analysis shows that they are far less emitting per kilowatt hour than some other energy forms. And so it's all in there. I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to hit on.
No, I'd definitely like to. And thanks so much for that question, Melanie, especially on the consistency and methodology. So for those who are not aware, and I think part of it, we've been doing a lot on that actually, and some might have heard of the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, where we launched it over 20 years ago, 25 countries. Of course, we have IEA. And so we've been doing a lot on not just the emissions, for one specific step, but the upstream emissions, including natural gas leakage and so forth. And so we actually, we have, some of you may have heard of GREET. GREET is a life cycle emissions tool developed at Argonne National Lab. And we actually have a global GREET now, trying to make sure we have consistency across the countries. It's something that's just in the process of being launched. And then we also at COP, actually, we had 38 countries sign up to not just, ideally it'd be great if everyone had the kind of consistent framework methodology, but since they don't necessarily, it was really an letter intent for a mutual recognition on not just the life cycle analysis, but certification schemes and frameworks. So especially as we try to look at international trade for, let's say, hydrogen derivatives, that's a huge issue. And so a lot in that space. And so maybe one request is how do we help increase awareness, because not everyone's aware of what's been happening over years in the making. And so we actually, some might have heard of the Breakthrough Agenda that was also launched at COP. 2-3 years ago, or deputy secretary and others. And so there are different basically specific themes. Hydrogen's one of them. There's also industrial and others. And so it's really a framework to coordinate. There's Clean Energy Ministerial, Mission Innovation, IEA. There's all these different partnerships, I think, helping to address those types of questions. And so Breakthrough Agenda is helping to kind of coordinate that landscape and make sure that we're all not in different boats in different rivers, rowing in different directions. And then specifically to your question on industrial, obviously hydrogen has a big role there. We have several new projects that we've just launched specifically for direct reduction, also integrating with thermal resources. And then what's really, really amazing, it's just completely, I have to pause for a second and take my pulse here, because we have $7 billion now for the hydrogen hubs, and with the private sector, it's about $50 billion. And so we'll have 7 regions across the country that really will have that hydrogen at scale. And then what we're also doing is overlaying, I think there's about $6 billion, and we set up a whole new office of clean energy demonstrations for industrial decarbonization. So we're actually mapping out where could there be this large scale hydrogen production in proximity to potential industrial sites. So again, a lot of that is kind of in process. So happy to talk more about that.
I think Jen and Sunita have nicely covered life cycle analysis. I won't belabor it. I will say that my favorite life cycle analysis is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has a very comprehensive report that required incredible amounts of consensus across the world, and it takes into account things like the concrete required. I thought one of your interesting comments was about transmission, and I wanted to say, actually, one of the things that I have to take my pulse about, and the answer for me is always nuclear, but is the notion that we could leverage the existing transmission lines, especially for retiring and retired coal plants, but also at existing nuclear sites, just to avoid that entirely, to not bother sort of getting the permitting to put new transmission through other people's yards. And nuclear is a nice opportunity for that, because coal plants, they boil water, they make a few hundred, maybe 1,000 megawatts worth of power. Nuclear power plants, exactly the same thing. It's just a slightly fancier way of boiling water, and you're making a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 megawatts of power. And so the power lines are right, and even the workforce is right. So the people physically at those locations, the retiring and retired coal plant sites, have welders and electricians and steam turbine management and boiler makers, and all the kinds of folks that run a thermal power plant, whether it's coal or nuclear, are going to be very similar in sort of shape. And I think that's a really critical sort of efficiency that we all need to be thinking about more, because there's a real opportunity to save. And I think Secretary Ketterdine said this earlier, but the jobs really matter when you're sort of talking about whole industries that could be displaced in this transition.
Yeah, the jobs really do matter. Mm-hmm. So just so you all know, that clock is not right. We actually have 10 more minutes, not 20 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So maybe I want to save time for more questions. And I don't know if you've all seen the studies, those of you who teach, that if you ask students to listen to a lecture, after about 15 minutes, their heart rate is typically the same as if you would ask them to meditate. And then people's heart rate picks up when they know the end of the class is 10 minutes away. So that's why I wanted to point out we're 10 minutes away from the end of this panel. So you guys think about what your questions are, and I'd like to stack up a bunch of rapid fire questions if you'll help me out with that. Before we do that, while people are thinking about their questions, are there any quick remarks on difficult sectors to decarbonize, radical game-changing technologies that are kind of on the far horizons, and what's needed to accelerate them that we haven't already covered? Yeah.
I'll take a quick hit. Basically, we recognize that industrial decarbonization is classically the tough to decarbonize thing that people talk about when it comes to decarbonization like that. And we actually have been looking at some efforts at the agency recently with respect to how you can use AI to scale novel chemical processes. Not so much just we're at the point where we can use AI for catalyst design and materials design. We have this at small scale, but how do we get this such that we can actually take our leapfrog from 10 years up to pilot scale to maybe shrinking that down to a year if we actually started doing rapid things with respect to that. And so I'll go ahead and leave it that one, but that's one way we've been starting to look at that.
Cool. Katie, Sunita, anything else? Hydrogen.
Yes. Yeah, since we only have 8 minutes left, they'll pass.
Yeah, similarly, I said earlier, nuclear, it's hot, 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 right? And so if it's quite hot, it's easier to use for things like, chemical industry applications, paper, like all kinds of stuff. That's why X-Energy is deploying their first reactor at a Dow Chemical site in Texas to replace the coal plant that they currently use to power their chemistry. So Seadrift, Texas, getting a nuclear plant to replace the coal plant that was fueling their Dow Chemical site is a sort of canonical example.
Cool. Okay, we have a lot of other great brains in the room too. Can I just quickly stack up a couple of questions? Oh, good, awesome, yeah. Who's got the mic?
It's over here.
I got a mic.
I have one.
Yeah,
whoever's got the mic.
We can't really see anything.
I got
there's
the
a
mic.
handful of youth over here.
Start beatboxing on the mic.
Okay, great.
Over here, I'm short, but I'm standing up, Doesn't make a difference, I know. So in particular, my good friends, DOE people, hello, everybody. Questions really about hydrogen and nuclear. Definitely excited about their opportunities and their potential, but I've also been on the front lines speaking with a lot of our community groups across the country who have a lot of trepidation about these technologies in particular. For hydrogen, it's of course being on the end of natural gas pipelines and increase in NOx emissions, or potentially increases in ammonia plants and ammonia toxicity and emissions and everything associated with that. And then of course for nuclear, a lot of it about the sourcing and the mining of the uranium and where it's coming from, and a lot of that being on tribal lands and so forth. So my questions for you all is, we at DOE and in academia and other places are very good at techno-economic evaluations of solutions without necessarily integrating in the social aspects of those elements. And so how are we changing that this time around to ID those social impacts? And how are we creating safeguards and rails to make sure that we're not repeating the same errors that we did with the fossil energy system build-out?
That is such a great question about how to include social thinking and communities in the planning. Let me stack up a few more questions, and then we'll take them all at once.
A very big opportunity actually is grid connectivity to leverage load and then supply. And especially that would enable short duration storage, which is already available. So I'm wondering on the grid connectivity side, would DOE or ARPA-E have initiative to look into the benefit and opportunity to deploy?
Excellent. So grid connectivity and short to medium term storage. Yeah, next question.
Can you hear me? Great. Lindsay with Clean Tomorrow. Thanks so much for the great panel. My question is about demand side initiatives. We've talked a lot about the growth in demand in electricity and power, but I'm curious, especially on heavy manufacturing and industry, as Secretary Kennardine mentioned, if we're going to produce so many more products, how do we lower the green premium, and what's the role of demand side initiatives for the technologies you all have been talking about?
Awesome, demand side initiatives. And then we'll take the fourth one, and then we'll do some answers. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anna Siefkin. I'm with the Department of Energy, and I'm a C3E ambassador, so glad to be here today. I want to follow up on the question, because I was really going to ask about NIMBY, because those are issues that I'm sure you're having. But I wanted to understand, related to a question we had earlier about storytelling and communication, because that's an important part of this, is how do we get the word out about how important these technologies are, and that people should not have fear that they're not going to be harmed. Thank you.
Awesome. And now the last fourth question,
okay.
The fifth fourth question.
Sarah Fike from ExxonMobil and Hydrogen Technology Development. I'm noticing a strong trend in the need for high temperature materials between nuclear and hydrogen and the space race. Is there any ramp up in development and work in those spaces beyond silicon carbide and graphite?
Okay, what a great set of questions. Who wants to go first?
Start.
Sunita, excellent.
So maybe just first to Sunrisa's question, something that we're doing, again, it's really challenging. I think we definitely recognize the importance of it. But we do have the community benefits plans for the first time. We've never had that before. And then we also just announced new projects, and we've never done this before, new competitively selected projects specifically on lessons learned and best practices for community engagement. And then 4 projects, and then 6, 7 new projects specifically on lessons learned and best practices for siting and permitting, and this is all just in the hydrogen space. So we just announced those awards. I think hopefully that will help. And then quickly on some of the other questions, the grid connectivity, again, really good point there. I think one thing maybe I'll mention is fuel cells are not really talked about as much. Even with data centers, you can use natural gas right now. Much more efficient than combustion, and then of course transition to hydrogen, and then hydrogen for medium and long duration energy storage. I think a lot, I know everyone's waiting for 45V as well, so if you have behind the meter, how clean is the grid, so still issues there. And then on the demand side initiatives too, I think, I'm not sure if many people know about what Germany did on H2 Global, but basically it's a contracts for difference type of approach where you have an auction and you can essentially subsidize the cost, so you can pull on the demand. And so we also did announce, and more details coming soon, on carving out some of the hydrogen hub money to really help incentivize that demand, sustained demand and offtake. And then we also launched a hydrogen interagency task force with 12 agencies, the White House, and looking specifically at how can even the federal government's critical loads, maybe fleets, help to catalyze that offtake, like we did with the forklift case. So completely agree that we need demand. I think telling the story, maybe I mentioned this before too, but again, with so many decades in hydrogen, government, industry, when I first moved from industry to government, many people thought I was moving to NIH, and I was always really perplexed. And it turns out they thought fuel cells were the same as stem cells. So I completely agree with the importance of telling the story and just the awareness. And so I think even these kinds of venues can help if we spread the word without having to tell every Uber driver about hydrogen. And I'll pause there. I think there were...
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Katie, I would love to hear your thoughts, particularly on the community buy-in around nuclear. I know you mentioned the jobs aspect, which is
matters.
Important.
Yeah, it doesn't matter as much as consent, right?
Yeah.
You can bring as many jobs and as much money and as much transparent, radical communication and storytelling as you want to a community, but if they don't want it, or if they have, especially in the case of tribal communities that have been historically disadvantaged, especially in the mining around weapons and our weapons complex, you shouldn't be building in their community. You have to accept that there will be some places that are welcoming communities for some technologies and some are not. You should keep engaging with those people, keep telling stories, keep engaging with their questions, meeting them where their concerns are. It's easy for me to say, but I think what it actually takes to do is you show up at Nuclear Energy Tribal Working Group meetings and you engage the First Nations Major Projects Coalition of Canada, and you really dive deep whenever there's an opportunity, but never, ever, ever put a plant where people don't want it. That's, I think, the bottom line. I think there's always going to be a couple people, a few voices. No American town has any, has a complete consensus. But I think you do need to really recognize whether you have or do not have the support of the community, but also the state that you're deploying in. And I think, in the context of high temperature materials, I'll simply say silicon carbide and graphite are great and enough, generally speaking, for our existing reactors and new reactors that we have coming online, but not probably for fusion, where we have serious problems with what's called the first wall. If anyone wants to talk to me about that over wine, I'm happy to discuss it.
And can I mention one thing, too, that I forgot was...
And then I'm going to give Katie one more word. So, sorry, Jen, one more word.
With Sunri's office and in my office, we actually developed this pilot program for community engagement called Harnessing Hydrogen. We did it with the Boston Science Museum, and it's basically a card game where it helps you optimize, look at all the different factors, like if you're putting in a fuel... Again, how do you produce the hydrogen, deliver it, what are the end uses, and kind of optimize and get the word out. So we've done it with a few communities, and it's available at no cost, so anyone can use it. And we're trying to kind of spread the word that way in terms of storytelling, but also addressing some of the challenges that Sunrisa mentioned.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'll try and be, so much has been said about consent, and I agree with it. The only thing I'd add is another important piece of consent is recognizing that it's temporal in its nature, and that it's important to continue the engagement, and that's an important facet there. When it comes to the grid, one of the things that we've been looking at is how we can leverage our current grid infrastructure such that we could actually layer DC transmission within that. There's been significant innovations with respect to power electronics and the ability to normally when you have a DC grid, your substation is just massive and it drives the capital cost significantly huge. But courtesy of the technological innovation, it seems that we're able to get that form factor much more compatible with what we might anticipate for a classical substation. At least we think that's possible. So we're looking at innovations there. And then I'm forgetting the other one that was, but we were already running out of time. Oh, trying to make sure that demand side compatibility. One of the things we've been thinking a lot about is how we leverage cheap intermittent electricity to drive our chemical processes that we see with iron or hydrogen or other things that you might need. And classically, you run these flat out 99.999% capacity factor. You have to completely reimagine what your chemical engineering might look like if you do that from an intermittency side. It's possible to think about it, but we've had a couple of different initiatives looking at that. So.
And there was at least one poster about this outside earlier. Yes. So good.
Yeah, I think the demand side management is so huge. I have so many more questions for you guys, and I know there's more questions out here, but I think we're at time, so please join me in thanking our panelists.
Beyonce.
Very good.
Yeah.